All right, and we're on air. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Codementor Office Hours. My name is Wei Ting, and thank you very much for joining us today. Today, we're very excited to have Tom with us here today.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, Tom is the VP of Engineering at Typeform, a great company with over 150 people and 60 engineers based in Barcelona. And Tom today is going to give a very quick talk here first, and then we'll open up for Q&A. And in the meantime, feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A session. So everyone, please welcome Tom.
All right, over to me, I guess. Huh? Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for having me here. Let's dive right in. I thought we're going to start with like a very short introduction of myself. So that's me. You know, I'm Tom. I'm an engineer by heart, meaning I started my career as a professional software engineer, and then like over the years moved more into this whole management thing. If I'm not working, then I'm usually out sailing somewhere. And I run a little weekly newsletter called onherdingcats.com, which deals with issues like that aspiring engineering managers might face, and a couple of tips and tricks there. So that's enough about me. Let's dive right in. Managing people is hard, and that's one of the things that a lot of people have experienced is when they make the transition from being an individual contributor into a management role, they face kind of like a difficult challenge. And the one big change that I've experienced in the past is that as a manager, your main way of getting things done is you have to work through people. So it's not you alone anymore who sits behind a keyboard and does amazing stuff. It's actually you having to get work done through other people. And the way to do that is through communication. And communication with humans is difficult. And I want to dive a little bit into why this is and what we can do about this. So let's move in. Like, if you think about the things that software engineers do, in a way, we're communicating with computers, right? Like I ask a computer to do something, and then that computer interprets the thing that I'm asking it to do, and then I get a result. And that communication is very well structured, right? We have tools that help us to make that communication very efficient. We have compilers, we have interpreters, linters, all of these things that make sure that if I express an intent, the machine can actually understand that intent. And you always use this little example, like, let's say I ask a computer, hey, can you print hello world? A computer will tell me if they don't understand that command, right? It will tell me, hey, look, print, I don't know what you want from me here. And I can go and I can fix that problem. Well, that's not necessarily the case if you're communicating to another human being, right? So,
sorry, Tom, just to interrupt. Are you sharing your slide right now?
Yes, I do.
Okay, you're not doing screen sharing. Can you try to?
Okay. Let me go back then. Why am I not sharing my screen? Okay, give me 1 sec.
Thanks.
It says I'm sharing my screen here.
Can you click on like the screen share button?
Okay, let me do this thing again.
Yes, we got it.
Is that better?
Yes.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what happened here. All right, let's see. So, can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, cool. So let's jump back to the example, because it kind of like makes an important point, right? If you communicate to a machine, we have tools that make that communication easy for us as humans, right? We have compilers and we have things that tell us, hey, you're not communicating very well. I get immediate feedback. That's not necessarily the case when you communicate to another human being. And I found this quote, I don't know who said it, but it always stuck with me. The problem in human communication is that communication is what the receiver does. So when we communicate, it's not necessarily what I'm saying is important. It's more important of what the other side receives, right? Like how the words that I'm saying are being interpreted on the other side. That's what makes communicating with other human beings so difficult. And I wanted to give you a little example. I'm going to show you a little image, and you can take a quick look at it, and we'll talk about what you're going to see there. So if I show you this image very quickly, and that's it. If I ask all of you what you have seen, roughly 50% of people will have seen a young woman that looks away. Roughly another 50% of people will say they saw an old woman. How can it be? How can it be that we saw the same image, but what we're actually interpreting is something else? We saw something different. That's exactly what is difficult in human communication is that communication happens through interpretation, and it happens through perception, and that's where things get difficult. So this is not a scientific model or anything, but I found this is a helpful way of thinking about how humans communicate with each other. So we communicate through a set of filters that exist in our heads, right? So if, let's say, the person on the left side here wants to communicate a message to the person on the right side, that message will have to pass through a set of filters, like the person's experience, their values, their beliefs, and it will form a concept in their mind. Now, if that person responds to that message, basically sends a message to the person on the left-hand side here, that message will also pass through a set of filters. The person's worries, their mood, their culture, language barriers, all of these things. So because communication passes through these filters, and communication is what the receiver does, communication is very difficult, and there are no tools for us to make sure that what we're saying is what the other person actually understands. And this is a really helpful model of keeping in mind when you're talking to other people, when you're trying to communicate a message, which is, as a manager, the most important thing that you do is you communicate. So the question becomes, how can we fix that? Well, the number one thing that you can do to address that communication problem is you have to build a strong relationship with the person that you're communicating with. And there's actually research into a theory or a model that's called LMX, the leader-member exchange, that researches how relationships between leaders and members affect the way they can communicate. And there's research that suggests that a strong relationship is directly correlated with the quality of the working relationship, and through that with job performance. So from that we can conclude that as managers, one of the main things that we have to do, or if I had to boil it down to one thing that you have to do, would be build relationships with people around you. So how do we build these relationships? The number one thing the number one tool that you have as a manager is your one-on-one meeting. Your one-on-one meeting with the people that are reporting to you, with your direct reports. It's a very powerful tool. It's time well spent, and I think it's in general undervalued of the value that these meetings create in building relationships with your direct reports. So if I would have to give an advice, to starting managers on how to actually get started becoming better managers, is you schedule your one-on-one meetings, and these meetings become very important. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how you can go about them, and some tips and tricks on what you can do to make sure these things are effective. The way I treat my one-on-one meetings is I schedule them every week. They are 30 minutes long. They have a fixed time, and they have a fixed slot in my calendar. All of you know that there's, calendars are always in flux. There's things going in, things going out. Well, the one-on-one meetings that I have with my direct reports are the things that never change. They are solid on my calendar. They have the highest priority. And the reason for that is because it becomes a rhythm. It becomes the rhythm with which I build relationships in my organization. It also becomes the rhythm with which I manage my part of the organization. So every week I have 30 minutes that I know I have time, quality time with my direct reports, where we can talk about anything or anything. And it's very important to stick to that schedule and to give these things priority. Because if you reschedule these meetings, you're hurting the relationships that you build, because the message that you're sending is that there's something that is more important than the relationship with the people that you're supposed to manage. There's often I get the question of, okay, so let's say I have these meetings. What do I talk about in these meetings? Well, it kind of depends on where you are in the process of building the relationship. What I do, if I start as a manager in a new organization, for instance, I sit down with each of my direct reports and I say, hey, I'm going to schedule a 30 minutes talk for us every week. And we start off by getting to know each other. You know, we share some of my personal background. I want to learn a little bit about you as my direct report. I want to find out, you know, what drives you, your personal situation. You can start by like getting to know each other. One thing that I see what managers often do, which doesn't work very well, is they treat their one-on-one meetings kind of like a status update meeting. So I would strongly suggest against that, especially in the beginning, because the main purpose of these meetings is, you know, not to get your status updates. The main purpose is to build a relationship so that you can communicate more effectively. That's not to say that I never talk about status updates in my one-on-one meetings, right? If I have a strong relationship with one of my direct reports, after, you know, we've spent a couple of months together, we know each other, I might ask, you know, about status updates on a big important project. But it is important to not forget what the main purpose of these meetings is. So be careful with the trap of, you know, using your one-on-ones as status updates. One-on-one also creates vehicle to talk about things like goal setting, career development, for giving feedback, all the things that are expected from you as a manager. I work all of these things through our one-on-one meetings. That's why I think they are the most important tool that you have as a manager to get things done, really. And that's why you shouldn't reschedule them. Okay, you know, when we're talking about management, we're talking about a lot of different things, right? We're talking about setting priorities, we're talking about defining processes, we're supposed to coach people, we need to mentor people, we make hiring decisions, we work on budgets. There's a lot of topics, and I don't think, you know, within 1 hour we could like even touch all of these. But the most important thing is build those relationships with your direct reports. Everything else kind of builds on top of that. So I also wanted to quickly talk about what you can expect, because that's a question that I get very often is people ask me, okay, like, how do I know whether this whole management thing is for me or not? What are like the expectations? What are some of the good things that I can achieve in being a manager? What are some of the bad things of becoming a manager? So I quickly want to run through those. So here's a couple of good things, or a couple of things that you might find interesting when you become a manager. As a manager in an organization, you have a bigger impact. Your impact as an individual grows beyond what you can do as an individual contributor, and that's something that, for instance, I find very, very motivating. Is you can shape an environment rather than just solving isolated problems, and yeah, I find that's a very important and a very good thing. I also find being a manager is a very meaningful task, because yeah, at the end of the day, if you're a good manager, you will have a long-lasting impact on people's lives. You know, we all spend a lot of time at work. We all have, you know, ambitions and goals that we want to achieve, and at the end of the day, as a manager, you are the person who is responsible for making those things happen. So you can have a real impact on people's lives, lasting impact, and that's something that I find very motivating. Another thing that I find is very interesting about this role is that, you know, sometimes companies can make decisions that are just outright stupid, or like not very good decisions. It's because organizations sometimes just make mistakes. And as a manager, you can make sure that you don't let that happen. As a manager, you are kind of like the buffer between the organization or the company that you're working for and the people that you manage. So in becoming part of that process, you can make sure that your company does the right things for the people that work there. And yeah, I think management as a whole is an ever-evolving topic. It's not that we're, you know, done, that we figured it out. No, it's we're constantly breaking new ground. We're constantly learning about how to be more effective, how to be more efficient. how to build better relationships, how to get more things done, how to get the right things done. It's a very fast-moving field, and it's very innovative. So especially lately, we see a big shift in how organizations are being built, how we think about things like responsibilities and accountabilities. All those topics are highly innovative, and lots of things happening there. So that's quite exciting. So those are the good things. There's of course a downside as well. One of the things that I think are difficult for managers is you will make mistakes. I mean, everybody does. You cannot avoid making mistakes. The problem as a manager is that your mistakes are almost always costly, right? They are almost always very expensive. Think about like making a wrong hiring decision, for instance. Like that's a very costly mistake. Or think about a mistake that you make where you don't realize that one of your directs has a certain problem at work and you don't address that problem, or you don't help them grow their career and they leave the company. Those are all costly mistakes. So the stakes are high. Another difficult thing that you have to deal with as a manager is that often you cannot claim the credits, right? Because you work through other people, so the credits typically belong to those people. So if you like the spotlight and if you like to claim the credits, management might not be for you, because if as a manager you claim credits for something that somebody else has achieved or somebody else has done, you're seriously hurting a relationship. And if you continue doing that, bad things will happen. Another thing that I realized that is special about the role as a manager is that it's an uphill battle. So you very rarely get a sense of achievement and accomplishment. I remember, when I was working as an engineer, you get a buzz from solving a hard technical problem. If you've been, banging your head into the wall over fixing a bug and you finally made it, there's a very strong sense of accomplishment. That feeling is something that you rarely get a manager, because you work through people, you work through an organization. Your work is mostly influencing, it's mostly directing. So often you will realize that you don't get that sense of accomplishment. And yeah, the last thing is often you find yourself in situations where there is no clear winner between different options. You have to choose between a rock and a hard place. You are the buffer between the people that you manage and your organization. So often decisions are not as clear cut, and you have to work through trade-offs, and that can be very difficult. And that was pretty much everything that I wanted to say. So the most important thing, that if you take one thing away from this presentation, is you have to work through other people, and to be able to do that, you have to communicate effectively, and you have to build those relationships. Very important. And with that, let's go to the Q&A.
Oh, yeah, that was great. Thank you. So I guess very quick first question that I have here is how do you spend your time? How does your day-to-day look like? Do you even write code now as an engineering manager right now?
Okay, so me personally, I don't write code for a living anymore. Sometimes if I have a couple of hours on a weekend when I'm not out sailing, I might toy around with a little side project, but this is not my main responsibility as a manager in this organization. We do have, in our organization, we do have team leaders, managers that manage a smaller group of people who are still contributing technically. So I wouldn't per se say that as a manager you cannot code anymore, but I think that's a very tricky position to be in, because you're kind of doing both things half and half, but not really, and it becomes tricky because the one thing that you can't do as a manager, you can't impose your opinion on other people, because that's very disengaging and it will hurt your relationship, and it will mean you'll get less things done. And as a contributor to the code base, it's very easy to fall into this trap. And I've certainly made that mistake in the past, that I said, oh, well, I know exactly how to fix this thing. Let me just quickly, code this thing. Well, it's very disengaging for people around you. So How I spend most of my days? Well, I actually have like a very, very strong rhythm of how I organize my week, and I think that's something that as a manager you have to become very good at. It's something that you have to learn, and you have to be very good at is deciding how you spend your time, because at the end of the day there will always be more things to do than you possibly can achieve, and you need to decide what your priorities are, and you need to stick to your priorities. So to give you like a little idea of how I organize my time, usually on Mondays I have my team meeting. We talk about what happened the last week, we talk about what's going to happen in the next week, we tackle some of the organizational issues that we have. I use my team meeting to organize to announce like organizational changes, or update my team on things that are important but that they might not necessarily be aware of. I do all of my one-on-ones on Tuesday, so Tuesday is a very busy day, but there's a reason for doing it that way. Tuesday is a good day because it's still early in the week. So you can still make adjustments if you need to get something important done during that week. And typically, at the beginning of the week, things are still a little bit more in flux than later in the week. Wednesdays, I keep completely meeting free. So Wednesdays is a day where I don't accept any meetings, and I actually get some work done. So I might write documents, I might review documents, I might push a couple of projects that I have, push them forward. So this is where I do most of my content type of work. I try to do the same thing on Thursdays, but usually like Thursdays meetings start creeping in. And then Friday is usually spent in reviews, in meetings, wrapping up the week and preparing for the next week. That's how I mostly spend my time. A lot of my time is spent in interviewing, making hiring decisions, depending on where your organization is. I think that's a big part of being a manager. Yeah, that's how I spend my time.
Just curious about, like, you have 60 developers roughly at Typeform. Like, what's like the structure? Like, there's VP of engineering. Like, how many direct reports do you have? Like, how many like director level, engineering manager level team leads?
So we have a structure. So I have let me think. I have 5 engineering managers report into me right now. I also have a couple of engineers reporting into me right now because they are a part of the organization where we don't have a manager yet. So usually what I do is in these situations, I'll just take them on as direct reports. The way this works for us is we have cross-functional teams, and these teams are grouped into higher level concepts that we call colonies. There's a whole story behind that. It's probably a little bit too much for today, but those are basically groups of teams that work on a certain part of the product, and the engineering managers are embedded within those teams. So typically our engineering managers are managing between 5 to, I would say, a maximum of 12, 13 people. You don't want to stretch it much further than that. We don't have like a layer in between that, so we don't have like director level in between yet because we don't feel like we need it.
Okay, so let's go with a first question from the audience. So basically, cool. Technical skills and facilitation skills are 2 different paradigms. How do you make yourself visible for leadership skills or facilitation while being individual contributors? So I guess the question is, how do you get to be seen as a potential future leader of the engineering organization while still being an individual contributor?
So I think, leadership and management are 2 separate things, and you can be a leader without being a manager, and that's actually very important. You can lead on the technical side, and then you need to ask yourself the question, what does that mean? For me, leadership means developing a strong vision. For me, it means understanding not only the problem itself, but also the problem in a broader context. It means driving consensus. I think this is a very important part, especially as a technical leader. And I think through those mechanisms, you can show that you have those leadership skills, right? If you are the person that other people come to if they cannot resolve a conflict, for instance, and you manage to create consensus with those people, that will be recognized as a leadership skill. If you take ownership over a certain problem, that will show that you're a true leader, right? By that I mean, if there's a problem, take ownership. Like, don't try to point fingers, but like take actual ownership and assume responsibility and accountability. That will show that you are a true leader. Does that make any sense? Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think so. I'll let Canoe ask any follow-up questions if there's any.
Okay.
Another question from us is actually, I guess, based on your short presentation, basically engineering management, a huge part is all about like building a strong working relationship and building trust, right? Other than one-on-ones, like what are some of the little things that you do to help build a relationship with your fellow colleagues? I mean, do you deliberately like go out to grab a beer with people? Like, do you like host like regular? What are some like the tactics that some of the fellow aspiring engineering managers can borrow?
Yeah, so indeed, like it's very important to build like strong relationships with people that you are directly responsible for. The next step is build strong relationships with people around you, right? Let's say you're in engineering, build strong relationships with people in product, for instance, or with people in finance, whatever it is, like whoever you interact with. Strong relationships will always help you. As far as tools, one thing that I find is very effective, we have a thing which we call lunch roulette, which is that's actually like a Slack bot where you join a channel and every week you get randomly matched with somebody and to go and have lunch. And I do that a lot. I have almost like every day I have lunch with somebody in the organization. Because it's a great way to have a conversation, to get to know people, to start building those relationships. While you're sharing a meal together is great. In terms, we have another thing which is similar. It's called the coffee roulette. Just go and have a coffee with somebody. You always find 10-15 minutes in a day. Use those 10-15 minutes to build a relationship with somebody. That's a very effective tool. I would say in terms of behaviors, I think being authentic is probably the most important trait. So if you're not really interested in people, people will know. So I think one of the really basics is you have to be authentic. You actually have to an authentic and an actual interest in people and in building that relationship to make that work.
Right. And you also spoke about one-on-ones as being a very part about building a relationship. Like, how do you usually structure one-on-one meetings? Do you go to a conference room, or do you deliberately try to make it casual by grabbing a coffee? But I mean, there's only so many coffees that you can drink on a daily basis. So.
That's a good question. So for me, the one-on-one it's not a casual chat, right? It's my most important business meeting. If I would cancel a meeting with my CEO if I had to, but I would take the one-on-one. So from that perspective, I think you need to treat it with some rigor, right, and with some discipline. So for me, the way I run my one-on-ones, and other people might do different things, but I make sure I have a meeting room. It's I make sure I don't bring my laptop. I make sure I come prepared. So what I do is before I go into one-on-one, I review my notes from the last week. I prepare a couple of points that I want to talk about. I take notes during the meeting so that I can prepare for next week. So I treat them as, my most important business meetings, and I invest time and energy in them. So like one of the things that I do is I schedule them half an hour, then I have half an hour time to wrap up the first one-on-one and prepare the second one. So then I have another one-on-one, then I have another half an hour. Basically do that for a whole day. It's not to say that you can't have coffee during your one-on-one, of course. It should not be something that is very formal, but it is an important meeting. So I like to have a meeting room. I like to be able to close the door. because it sends a signal that we're spending some quality time together. Sometimes I feel like I want to switch the context a little bit, and something that I found very effective actually is we do a walking one-on-one. We go for a walk, go outside, enjoy nature a little bit. That can help switching the context a little bit if you want to do something special, or if you have something that you want to discuss that might potentially be difficult or better be discussed outside of the office. You can use that to change the context a little bit, give it a little bit of a different spin. I wouldn't want to do that every week, but every now and then I think it's nice.
Are there any particular questions that you always ask in all one-on-one meetings?
So usually I start my one-on-one meetings with, so the way I structure them is I try to take 15 minutes for myself and then 15 minutes for my direct report. So depending on how long we've been working together, how strong our relationship is, I might start with different questions, right? If you just start working with somebody, it's all about getting to know each other. So it's totally fine to spend your first one-on-one or even the first 2-3 one-on-ones getting to know each other. Like ask people about their family background, ask people about their hobbies, ask people about how they ended up where they are. You need to get to know that person, and it also shows that you genuinely care about that person. Then usually I ask things like, what's going on in your world? Like what's on your mind? Like I try to understand what a person is struggling with or a person is thinking about, just because I'm interested, And then of course there's like specific things that I prepare as a result of what happened during the week, or like some feedback that I've gotten. Might ask people like, hey, do you remember like that situation last week in that meeting? What happened? Like what was your perception? I tend to ask a lot of questions, which is a good thing. Get people talking.
Yeah, thank you. We have a incoming question from the audience. What advice would you give to an aspiring coder and software developer who wants to be an IT manager, which is the person asking the question?
So what advice would I give somebody who's been a software engineer and who has just been promoted into a management position? Is that the question?
Or who has aspirations to become an IT manager?
Okay, so for people who have an aspiration into management, I think ask yourself, you need to be very clear about your motivation. You need to have a very clear view of why you want to become a manager. I've often seen people becoming managers because it seems like a status. It seems like somehow that person is, has more authority, can operate with more independence, can make more decisions by themselves, can tell other people what to do, which couldn't be further from the truth. If you are a manager, like even though you've been given a level of authority, you can very rarely execute on that authority, because what it means is if you exercise your authority, you will break and burn relationships, and that will in the end make you very unsuccessful as a manager. So my first advice would be very clear what it is that motivates you to become a manager. Are you genuinely interested in people? Are you genuinely interested in process? Are you genuinely interested in building and forming organizations and shaping environments, in influencing, in communicating? Are those the things that interest you? If that's not the case, then I would not advise going down that route. Other things that are very important, as we said before, is you can train your leadership skills. You can show that you can be an owner and that you're authentic without being in that position, right? You can lead without being a manager, and that helps you kind of like developing those communication skills and these influential skills without being in that role first. It also like helps you try and test out the waters whether this whole thing is something for you or not. And then like, yeah, find somebody who's in that position. Like find the coach, find the mentor, find somebody who's been there and done that, who can help you explain that world a little bit better, who can help you find the right tools, and who can also like tell you, hey, watch out for these things. Those are things that you don't want to be doing, because yeah, again, as a manager, making mistakes is expensive. It's hard. It hurts. So the more you can avoid those mistakes, the better it is.
Okay, and a follow-up question to that is for someone who is like young, aspiring engineering manager who wants to start to climb the corporate ladder, right? Engineering manager, director of management, of engineering management, and then VP of engineering, right? Essentially, like the director of engineering versus VP of engineering. Do you feel there's a difference in terms of skills and qualities for these two different positions?
Look, I think I can only speak out of my like personal experience. I think if you talk to different companies, their interpretation of these titles are very different, right? A VP in Amazon, for instance, might manage, I don't know, a couple of thousand people, whereas, you know, a VP in Typeform manages 60 people. So when we're talking about these levels, you have to like talk about it in the right context. And, you know, a director on one company might be something totally different from a director in another company. In terms of how you progress your career as a manager, yeah, well, you have to show that you can be successful working through your team. You need to start building those relationships. You need to make people around you successful. Like this is one of the main goals that you can achieve as a manager, and how you get recognition is if people around you are successfur, then you've won. And that's when people will realize, oh, okay, you are ready for the next challenge. Manage your time well, be authentic, take ownership and responsibility, all of these things.
I actually recently had another discussion with another friend of mine who is actually a VP of engineering. He told me that, I guess one of the biggest difference that he found out was that when he was still a director, his direct boss was a VP, which is everyone was technical, right? So they only need to worry about like technical related things. But after he got promoted to become the VP of engineering, his boss is the CEO of the company, right? So he needs to train himself to how to communicate to a person who's not necessarily an engineering by training. So like how to talk to, how do you deal about this?
Yeah, so look, at the end of the day, it's the same skills, but on a different scale, right? I think it's a good trait for an engineering manager, independent of their level where they're at and how far they are removed from, let's say, the day-to-day software development where they sit in the organization. Being able to communicate with people outside of your organization is one of the key things, or one of the main responsibilities of a manager, right? Of course, you have to be able to communicate well. You have to be empathetic. You have to understand how another person sees the world and what are the things that they worry about, right? Remember the model with the filters? You need to understand their filters to be able to communicate well. So my main advice would be is learn how by observing how people communicate with each other, right? If you make that step from becoming a director, going from a director to a VP level, and now all of a sudden the CEO is your boss, you need to understand how your CEO sees the world. You need to understand what your CEO worries about. You need to learn, you know, how a business is being managed. Like, for instance, like learn key financial terms, learn how companies function, learn about organizational design. Like that's a skill that you'll have to learn as a manager anyway. It's just that it's a different level of abstraction, I would say.
Right, and I guess once you start to climb the ladder, sometimes you'll talk to like other parts of the organization where they have other different goals, right? So for example, the engineering departments usually care about code quality, where others, maybe sales and marketing or the CEO, actually care about like how fast can we ship this product, right? So how do you find a good balance of like development speed versus code quality, which is what the engineers are usually most care about?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. What helps me in these discussions is, at the end of the day, you have to understand that you all want the same thing, right? I'm assuming that you want your company to be successful, because if your company is successful, you're going to be successful. So even though people might worry about different things, at the end of the day, you're trying to achieve the same thing. Why do engineers worry about code quality? At the end of the day, it is about it is about being proud of the work that you've done, but it is also about your future ability to innovate, and this is what moves your company forward, and this is what your CEO worries as much as you as an engineer. So I think it is important to realize that at the end of the day, you're all working on the same goal, but you might look at different angles of how to achieve that goal. And being empathetic, meaning like trying to, or like really understanding how somebody who's not in engineering sees or thinks about achieving that goal, really helps in communicating well and also in making the right decisions.
Great, that was great, thanks. Here's another incoming question from the audience. Did you experience weird games, quote unquote, at higher levels of organizations, which I think this gentleman means politics? So he basically, a buddy of his who was a project manager, and he told him that sometimes in the manager world, there's a fight between resources. Like good projects, valuable stuff, they're limited. Like how do you deal about, like, I guess managing, like working with other colleagues, because companies, like resources are always limited, right?
Yes.
What's your comment about this?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions in here, right? So the first question, have I ever experienced politics? No, of course not, doesn't exist, right? No, of course, yes. People have their own agendas, and that's just a fact of life, and you'll have to deal with it. What I found the most useful is to be authentic and to be honest. Now that doesn't mean it works in every environment. That's a judgment call that you have to make yourself, right? But being authentic, not participating in political games that happen, will actually help you see these things a little bit more sober. Sometimes you get into like turf wars, like that person thinks they're responsible for this thing, but that other person thinks they're also responsible for that thing. They're fighting with each other over that. Usually what you can do is like try to stay away from these things, and if you get sucked into it, try to drive consensus, right? Try to acknowledge the fact that we seem to have a difference in opinion, and that we have to work together to resolve that conflict somehow, however that might look like. To your second question, how to deal with resourcing conflicts. The best way to deal with this is to find a mechanism. So that's something that I try to do a lot, and I think that's also like a tool that you can use as a manager to address this problem. And by that I mean, think about the process. Like as a company, you need to decide how you want to allocate the limited resources that you have. So that means you need to have a process. And as a manager, what you can do is you can try to facilitate defining and shaping and documenting that process. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to dictate how this thing is supposed to work, but what you can do is you can get people into a room, and you can try to facilitate coming up with a process that defines how, as a company, you want to allocate your resources, how you make those trade-off decisions, who needs to be at the table, what are the kind of like key metrics that you're looking at, what are the levers that you have and write that down, so that even though this might be a very difficult process, once you're done, you have a mechanism, and you don't find yourself in a room every week discussing if is this thing more important or is this thing more important. No, you'll have a process that defines, okay, we get together like once a month and we decide where do we want to invest. And if people are not happy with how things are going, then you can refer to, okay, let's refine the process. Maybe we're missing something out. Maybe we didn't understand correctly how this mechanism should work. But it becomes a discussion around the mechanism, and not so much a discussion around the individuals, which is a good thing.
Thanks. Here's another question from the audience. So what's like the ideal or best team culture to you, and how do you go about to build that culture in your team?
That's also very good, very difficult question. I think you have to separate my preferred culture as a person, my personal preference, and the culture of a company, because those are two separate things. I think as a manager, your role is to be kind of like an advocate of the company's culture, right? So on one hand, you can influence the company's culture. On the other hand, you need to make sure that you behave in accordance with the company's culture, and you shape an environment that reflects the company's culture. So one very, very strong way of doing that is to define a set of values, and often I get people roll eyes when I talk about things like values or company values, but they're actually quite important. They are actually a very important tool that you can use to define culture, because culture is such a weird thing. It's expressed through people's behaviors. So how do you actually define culture, and how do you shape it? Well, if you have values that reflect your company's culture, then you can use those values to identify behaviors that correspond to those values, and then you can start incentivizing that behavior. Like, let's say, for instance, one of the values in your organization is collaboration. You think for a person to be successful in your company, they need to collaborate. You can look for opportunities, or you can define, okay, what does that mean for an engineer, for instance, or what does it mean for a manager, or what does it mean for a finance person, in terms of behaviors. For an engineer, for instance, you might say, all right, if that engineer has a problem, or that engineer gets stuck on a bug, instead of spending days trying to nail it themselves, they go reach out, find somebody that can help them with it. They draw somebody else in that. They're pushing collaboration. So your next action would be to incentivize that behavior. So you might say, like, somebody who's very collaborative, you might point it out to other people. You might say, hey, this was very good. Like, look, he was stuck there. He reached out to another person, and look, it helped us actually solving that problem. Incentivize that type of behavior, whatever your mechanism for giving incentives is. Another tool that you can use to make sure you shape a certain culture is hiring people. Like, hire people that naturally exhibit those behaviors, right? There's a technique that's called behavioral interviewing, which I think is a very important skill also for you as a manager. Is decide what those behaviors are that you're looking for, and then decide how you can apply those to your hiring process to make sure that you're bringing people into the organization that are actually corresponding and reflecting your culture very well.
What are some of your most favorite behavioral interview questions?
So one of my favorite behavioral interview questions is, tell me about the time where you had, for a manager position, you had to deal with a different opinion that you had from your team, like a conflict in opinion. And tell me how you dealt with that conflict, because it shows a lot about how people go about identifying that there's a conflict, which strategy they have to resolve that conflict, right? Like you can resolve conflicts in many ways. You can try to ignore it. You can walk away from it. You can try to reach a compromise, which means both parties in the conflict kind of like need to move away from the ideal state and they compromise on something. Or you can try to strive for consensus, where like both parties agree on something that actually gets them what they want. So it kind of teases out very well how people go about conflict resolution. I have a whole catalog of questions that I ask. I also, you know, like to talk about like difficult situations. For instance, a situation where an engineer comes up and says, "Hey, I think I should get a raise." How do you deal with it as a manager? You know, do you just nod your head and say yes? Do you say no way? Like how do you deal with that situation? I think it's also very interesting. Also relates to conflict resolution, but an interesting behavioral question as well.
How about questions for individual contributors?
So like when we interview individual contributors, we typically do two things, right? So we do a technical interview to test their technical skills. For individual contributors, we also look for conflict resolutions, but we typically go for like a different example. We look for collaboration. Like an interesting question, for instance, is tell me about a time where you had a problem that you couldn't solve by yourself. How did you go about that? So collaboration is a very important aspect. I also really like to talk about ownership, and ownership is a very, you know, kind of like a fuzzy concept. But when I talk about ownership, I talk about more in the sense of really caring for something, right? Like ownership in the sense where if you rent an apartment, you might treat that apartment differently than when you own it. So yeah, those are topics that I think are very important and very interesting to talk about for individual contributors as well.
Thanks. Another question from the audience is more about like people management, right? I'm sure in your direct reports or people in your old team, they're they're underperformers and they're stars on the team, right? How do you handle like people in these two different buckets, or how do you deal with people who just don't want to contribute in the projects? Like, how do you go about that?
Okay, let's maybe start with the easy case first, right? Like, how do you handle people who are performing very, very well? Your job as a manager, I think, is first of all, recognize their talent, recognize what makes them so good. Try to like derive some behaviors from that, because that might be useful in general. And then find the right opportunities for them to make it to the next step, right? Like one of the main goals for you as a manager is get people around you promoted. So go and identify what is that person's main motivation, and what do they need to do to go to the next step. What are some of the gaps that they need to address, and then go and find those opportunities and work with that person to help them learn these things. Like for instance, let's say for a individual contributor to make it to the next level, they need to acquire public speaking skills. One of the things that you could do is you could go and find opportunities for that person to do public speaking, like meetups, for instance, or an internal company meeting. And you could help them by, I don't know, finding a bunch of books, finding online courses, getting training, help them preparing their presentations, to kind of like coach them and help them to acquire those skills. So there's a bunch of things that you can do with people who are like really strong performing. People that are not performing well, I think you first need to understand. You need to do two things. You need to make sure that expectations are clear, because sometimes, and quite often actually what happens is that we perceive somebody as not performing well, but the actually underlying root cause is a misunderstanding in expectations. The person might not know what is actually expected of them. And so you need to make sure that your expectations are crystal clear. However, you go about that, right? You could write them down. It could be through conversations. It could be through code reviews, whatever it is. Like you need to make sure that the expectations are set and understood. Again, communication is very important. And if that person understands the expectations and is still not able to deliver against those expectations, you need to understand why. Is there a lack in skills? Is there a lack of motivation? Is there, I don't know, personal problems? Is there what is it that stops them from getting to those expectations? Are they maybe in the wrong spot in the organization? And then it becomes, once you've identified this, it becomes about solving that problem. Like, if it's however you go about it. If it's a lack of a certain skill, we'll go and train that skill. Find a coach, find a mentor. If it's about the lack of motivation, figure out why is that? What is it that motivates that person? And search for opportunities to motivate them. And at the end of the day, of course, that is always something that that person needs to contribute as well. You cannot do it for them. What you can do is you can provide opportunities. You can give feedback. Feedback is also a very important tool, right? But you cannot do it for them. So you might find yourself in a situation where you've tried everything that you could, and it's still not working out. Well, then it's time to ask the question whether the person is at the right spot or not.
Thanks. I think we have a few minutes before time's up. Throughout your career, any role models that you particularly look up to?
Yeah, a lot of role models. I think like my first, the first boss that I had in my first job, I think was really a role model. And in general, like I try to look at successful people around me and try to analyze what makes them successful, and look at the kind of like the behaviors and the traits that they have, and then I try to replicate those. I think becoming better at what you do is a learning process, and that learning process is a result of you realizing that you're not as good as you think you are, and acknowledging the fact and doing something about that. So yeah, I would say like the first boss that I had at my first job, he was a real role model. He taught me a lot about how to be successful, what to look out for, and then in general, just people around me. I would not say that there's like a particular person or a particular person around me. I think it's just successful people around you that influence you, that you can learn from.
Awesome. Finally, do you have any recommended books or learning resources for individual contributors who want to transition into managers?
Well, so there is this cool weekly newsletter called onherdingcats.com. There's a lot of really good books out there. I don't think I can recommend particularly like things that stand out. There are some things that stand out, like the 7 Habits, for instance. What is the guy called who wrote it? I forgot the author's name now. I found that very influential book. If you're talking about how to improve yourself, there's another book that we have this management book club going on here. We recently read Behind Closed Doors from the Pragmatic Bookshelf, I think. I found that very good because it's very tangible. It's very tangible and actionable advice in there. I personally also really like a podcast called manager-tools.com. There's tons of really, really useful, actionable content there. Yeah, those are the things that I have on the top of my head.
Awesome. This is great. I think we're about to run out of time. So before we go, Tom, do you have any final advice for all the aspiring managers out there?
Yes, build those relationships, very important, and be clear about your motivations. That's also very important.
All right. So thank you very much. Thanks so much, Tom, for the time. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Let us know if you have any follow-up questions, and and please go sign up for Tom's weekly newsletter.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.